There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Your Mountain podcast. I'm David Wilms. I'm joined, as per the usual, I'm going to shake it up, by Nephi Cole.
Editor-in-chief of something, somewhere. I'm writing something.
What are you writing?
Yeah, mostly emails.
Editor-in-chief of Google Mail?
Yeah, well, I do Outlook too.
Or of your own email account.
Mm-hmm. Lots of emails.
Mike McGrady.
Hey, I do nothing.
Yeah, I know.
No, that's not true.
I've witnessed that.
Oh my goodness.
Anyway, we are here to talk about the Endangered Species Act for the third time. Mm-hmm. Right? Oh, I was going to mention before we talk about the Endangered Species Act. Mm-hmm. So we're sitting here, and we've called this on several podcasts. We're sitting here in your basement. We're sitting here in studio, as we've called it, 1A. And I got to thinking, I'm like, why in the world do we call it Studio 1A? It's the only studio. I mean, Studio 1A kind of implies that you have a 1B or a 1C or a 2 or
who came up with Studio 1A?
I did. It's my damn studio. I can call it what I want. It's now the studio, the home of the free and the brave.
I'll take it.
So,
That's a bold.
That's kind of long. It's hard to remember.
Okay,
I'll
make it longer then.
Welcome to the studio,
the home of the free and the brave.
The home of the free and the brave, instead of Studio 1A. We might be able to work with that.
That's what its new name is. It doesn't matter how long it is. It's right.
It's better than 1A.
It makes me happy. It feels good.
You can have a defined name. There's no implication there. That's pretty crystal clear.
Just saying the name of that made me feel good.
It made you feel American.
Absolutely. What could be better? Nothing.
All right, so we're gonna work on that studio name. But
no, it's done.
All right, well, it might be. We'll see if it sticks. Anyway, Endangered Species Act. So we're on part 3. We've done 2 parts already. The first part we talked about the history of the Endangered Species Act, how it came into being. On part 2, we talked about how does the act operate? Just generally, how are they put on the list? How are they taken off the list? We talked about the general operations.
Right. We didn't cover a whole host of just day-to-day operations associated with the act. And there are a number of things that it provides that we just didn't even dive into.
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, we didn't talk about the consultation process with federal agencies. We didn't talk about the take prohibitions and the penalties for taking a species.
Yeah, right? the heavy hammer that comes down, right? The
big hammer of the act. We never talked about the big hammer. And we're still largely not going to. We're trying to give picture this as a 101 first day intro course on the Endangered Species Act, and you want to know just enough to be able to have a conversation and understand what's going on.
So for those of you hoping that this was going to go like 20 episodes long, we're tying a bow around it on this segment.
Sort of.
Oh.
Because the one thing I've learned in my career is that the Endangered Species Act never goes away, and it's always part. It's
now,
always,
Dave, if you're
in the back of your
nothing
mind.
else, you are persistent.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure we'll talk about it again.
We will talk about it again, but
not
maybe,
as the subject.
But maybe not in this way. But maybe we don't know. I'm not going to write anything off.
No, I wouldn't expect you to.
Anyway, today we're going to talk about. So there's a host of proposed changes to the act and the way the act operates that are being made out there, put forth by Congress and the administration. And we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about those at a kind of 30,000 foot level. We're not going to dive into the weeds, but give you a general sense of what's in those bills, proposed bills, regulatory packages, how you can participate in the process, and where we think they might be going in the coming weeks, months, years. So Always Nephi with his...
Oh my goodness, it was your phone.
No, that time it was yours. Mine beeped a little earlier. Siri wanted to know what was up. Always with the phone. Anyway, so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about what's going on at the national level and maybe a little bit of why. Less of the why. I think it's worth teeing it up, right? To say... the Endangered Species Act has not been amended in a substantive way since 1988. It has not been reauthorized since 1988 by Congress for continuing funding.
Right, which is Congress's way of saying, we want to continue this program. Yet, they've continued to fund it.
At varying levels.
Yeah, varying levels over time. So, adjusted for inflation doesn't keep up with the 1988 dollars.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it actually hasn't even been adjusted for inflation.
Right.
And that's a separate dialogue about how the funding has worked. Because there are a couple of schools of camp out there on the Endangered Species Act. There's one school of camp that says the act works fine as long as you fund it appropriately. Mm-hmm. And there's another camp out there that says the funding might help, but unless you address some of the underlying challenges with the act, then all the money in the world isn't going to solve the problem. And so we need to address some of the underlying problems and the mechanics of the act and actually amend the language before we throw good money after bad. So there are a couple of schools of thought. I'll give you one. I just want to give one example before we dive into, the types of proposals out there.
Okay.
For everybody that thinks the ESA works as it's supposed to, most people don't interact with the ESA on a day-to-day basis. Is that fair to say?
I would think so. Yeah.
The vast majority. Most people also think the Endangered Species Act is a good thing. And that protecting species and preventing extinction is a good thing. And I don't know that anybody around this table would disagree that preventing extinction is a noble goal.
Yeah, everybody agrees with that. I say that, you're going to find a few people that don't, but basically we all agree that this is a noble goal. Everybody does.
But let me tell you a short story about an experience I had early in my career with the Endangered Species Act. And it's a microcosm of a much bigger issue, and one of the reasons why there's a large segment of folks that want to see changes made. And I'm not going to tell you where I was or who I was working for, except to say I was working, and you guys know, I may have talked about this on here before, I was working with black-tailed prairie dogs. So I was doing some research for black-tailed prairie dogs and associated species. And
is this a podcast where I get to tell you how much I don't?
No, we'll do that a different day. I know you don't like prairie dogs. But anyway, I was doing research on prairie dogs, and I was working for some landowners. And my job was to go out and map colonies, and do population assessments of colonies, find out what was there. At this time, this was about 20 years ago, at this time, black-tailed prairie dogs were a candidate species. They were warranted for listing but precluded due to other priorities. They eventually later, with new population estimates were determined not warranted, but at this time warranted but precluded. So you had a bunch of folks that were really nervous about what would happen if the species was listed. So I'm out there doing this work. And I mapped these prairie dog colonies over vast landscapes. A lot of these landowners had huge ranches, didn't know where everything was. Presented that data. And that information was used not to better understand where the prairie dogs were to manage them, but to understand where they were to eradicate them. And they wanted to eradicate them because of the fear of what would happen if that species was listed and if their land were classified as critical habitat for prairie dogs, and what that would do to their livelihood, their ability to continue to survive and do what they've done for generations out there. And that's just a small example, right? But that's a very real world example where
the negative disincentive of the Endangered Species Act, where you, as a landowner, there is not a positive for you to have an endangered species on your land. You didn't win. You didn't get a Christmas present when that happened. You didn't win the lottery. You're
potentially put out of business.
Yeah, your life just got extremely difficult.
Right. And yet these same landowners don't, they may not like prairie dogs, just like I know you don't, Nephi, but they don't want to see...
go ahead.
They don't necessarily want to see a species go extinct. They just want to be able to survive on their landscape and be able to continue to manage their land.
I'm going to interject quickly. So that I talked to a lot of ranchers, and I've worked with a lot of people up around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And when you look at these traditional ranches that have been here for 100 years, the reality is you talk to a rancher who has had a grizzly bear come in and kill livestock, rip stuff up. That rancher, if there were a financial incentive to him to have a grizzly bear on his place, and that helped him keep that ranch going and keep that ranch and his family for the next 100 years, he'll raise grizzly bears. But the problem is that incentive is not there. It's the opposite.
So that's one of the things that groups have been looking at, is how do we incentivize conservation, both when the species is listed, but before a species is listed, to try and prevent that species from being listed in the first place. So better ways to incentivize conservation is one of the focal points. And how do you do that? Do you do that through regulation? Do you do that through a statutory change? And so that's what we're going to talk about. And I just want to give you that example of one example of hundreds, maybe thousands out there, of why there has been such discussion and why there are such polarized camps over the Endangered Species Act. So for 30 years now, there have been a number of people and groups around the country that have said, we need to make some changes. And there have been a lot of proposals, and some of the proposals have been very, very partisan. And you obviously weren't going to go anywhere. They were trying to placate a certain demographic, a certain constituency by introducing a bill. They weren't going to go anywhere. Others have had a chance. I think back to the late 90s, and Dirk Kemp Thorne from Idaho, who was a senator from Idaho, later became Secretary of Interior. He had a proposal that he worked with the Clinton administration on and had support from the Clinton administration. Only in that instance, Senator Trent Lott didn't like some of the language of that bill and never gave it the light of day, and it never got through the Senate. Fast forward about a decade, in mid-90s, Representative Pombo from California had a bill pass the House that would have had some pretty dramatic changes to the Endangered Species Act, but it couldn't get through the Senate. So there have been a couple of efforts that have moved the needle on the discussion and had a chance of success, but it failed at one point or the other. So here we are in 2018, and we have three very distinct approaches going on. We got the U.S. House of Representatives, the Western Caucus of that, and I don't know. Mike doesn't like being thrown under the bus, but I was gonna, ask Mike if he wants to explain what the Western Caucus is of the House, U.S. House of Representatives.
Well, so in the House of Representatives, there are various groups that come together, coalescing around a particular issue. There can be Air Force caucus type situation where members who have an Air Force base in their district will come together to address and focus on Air Force issues. And so the Western Caucus would represent groups of members that are in the West.
So I figured that since because at one point you were a Hill staffer, right? In a prior life, you were a Hill staffer.
Long time ago.
So I thought, you might be able to answer that question. What's the Western Caucus?
Did you need more than that? I mean, it's pretty simple.
No.
Okay.
But the Western Caucus is generally very conservative.
Correct.
And they are coalesced around particular Western issues.
Right.
And they use they use that caucus as a mechanism to gain more influence in a much larger body.
Right. They work together on common issues across the West, and having that block vote and influences helps to get their issues pushed forward in the House of Representatives, which has 435 members, and one person is difficult to get the attention of the other 434, and so it just groups form and push different issues. And the Western Caucus is a good example of one that you mentioned.
So, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but earlier this summer, the Western Caucus, representatives from the Western Caucus introduced 9 separate bills that would change the way the Endangered Species Act operates or is implemented. And I'm not going to go into detail about what's in those bills, frankly, because I don't think those bills are likely going to go anywhere. Maybe you have a different thought on that.
Well, there are a variety of reasons why bills are introduced, and one of them is to set up conversations around ideas, and so they will likely have hearings on them and have testimony and gather information on the concepts that are put in those bills, but that does not necessarily translate into passage through the House or even House, Senate, and presentation to the President. So.
And they may or may not even have hearings. I mean, you don't have to have the hearing to start the dialogue, right? To have the conversation. Often you do. Right. Often that's the process they use, but it doesn't necessarily have to go through a hearing process.
And we've talked about this before, so just as a reminder to everybody, this doesn't just happen with ESA. There are other Senator Lee from Utah brought a bill, again, it's kind of a statement bill with people bringing these things to kind of reinforce what it is that they believe and they think and what they think their constituents want, and they might not go anywhere.
But so I'm not going to talk about the details of those bills. I am going to talk about the details of a discussion draft bill on the Senate side, though. So Senator Barrasso from Wyoming, earlier this summer, mid-July, put forth, I'm not going to say introduced, because he hasn't introduced anything, but he released for public consumption a discussion draft of a bill to amend the Endangered Species Act. And it's divided into a host of sections. There are things in there that aren't worth talking about, but there are 2 pieces in that bill, really 2 pieces that I want to emphasize and want to talk about a little bit here. And who knows where this one's going to go. There was a hearing held on the discussion draft in July, and don't know where it's going to go from here. But this one has some more legs because it's born out of a process started at a grassroots level out west among governors and stakeholders on the ground, and so there may be more legs and more opportunity to move a bill like this farther. Because of the groundswell of support that's behind it, right? But really, rather than going into all of the details of this bill, there are 2 things that I think are worth pointing out. One, so in part 2, we talked about the timelines in the Act, right? We talked about how when a petition comes in, and there's a substantive 90-day finding on that by the service, meaning there's enough information there to say this species may need some protection, we got to look closer. That we have this 12-month deadline that the service has to meet and that they can almost never meet, which has resulted in a rash of litigation and a handful of groups being able to help dictate the service's workload, right? So one thing that this bill does is it proposes to adopt what's called the National Listing Work Plan. The National Listing Work Plan is something that, during the Obama administration, when they were embroiled in these lawsuits over these mass petitions, and they entered into a settlement to prioritize their workload of those petitions involved in that settlement, one of the things that was born out of this was we need to come up with a process to prioritize future petitions that we receive, and future substantive 90-day findings that we have. And so working with those same groups that had sued them, and then also through a very public process, they took public comment on this and everything, but they created what was called the National Listing Work Plan, which is, in short, a 7-year work plan. It's a way for the service to prioritize the petitions that they receive or I should say, petitions that they receive that they give 90 days substantive finding on. So they're going to have to do a 12-month review, a 12-month finding. They have 7. They can drop these into what they call bins, 5 different bins, prioritization bins. And based on the bin they put these petitions in, there's a schedule for when they will address those. And it can take anywhere from 1 to 7 years. And so, for example, if a state is doing some great things with conservation, or an NGO is working with states and doing some great things with conservation for a species, that species may be put in a lower priority bin and may be given more like 7 years before the petition is addressed. As opposed to if you have a species that it's circling the drain, there's no conservation going on the ground, we got to deal with it right now. That's going to be a high priority item. The service is going to take a look at it right away and make that listing determination. And so it gives the service some flexibility to take into account situations on the ground, the scientific data that they have, and use a more scientific process to make determinations, listing decisions. Right? So one thing this bill does, it incorporates that policy of the Obama administration.
So how does that take into account the listing priority number guidelines that the Fish and Wildlife Service already has, that talks about, are they have significant risk, and they sort of already have a scientific prioritization of 1 through 12.
Well, you're talking about candidate species, though.
Right.
That's different.
Okay.
So that'd be totally different. They could still, with the National Listing Work Plan, they could still come out and make a determination of warranted but precluded for some reason, and then they'd use that same analysis that they have for candidate species. There are 5 distinct bins. It is, this species is circling the drain. We got to address it now. We got to deal with the petition now. There's data. There's ongoing research, and we know that these studies are going to be completed in the next 2 to 3 years, but they're just not ready right now. And this is going to be critical information for determining whether this species warrants listing or not. It goes into a lower priority bin. Things like that. So
these are such long names.
So this is the bins are made up of, when are you going to get to the 12-month finding?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Basically, it's when are you going to get. So it addresses that 12-month finding piece. Right now, it's in policy, and arguably, that policy, if somebody wanted to challenge that policy in court and say they're not meeting their 12-month obligations, if a court were to say we agree, all of that that whole policy could be ripped up, and they could be back to the way they were doing business before, which was sue and settle. Right now, those groups that had been suing aren't suing on deadlines because they're committed to this work plan process. So it's saying let's formalize that. It's working. Mm-hmm. It's a better standard than a strict 12-month deadline that was arbitrarily put in there in 1982, wasn't in the original act. So they're saying, let's try that. There's a fair amount of support for that. There's some things in this discussion draft that there's not support for. That's one thing that there's a fair amount of support for.
Right, because the justification for a 12-month deadline in 1982 was that Congress was trying to avoid foot dragging. That's the catchphrase from the testimony on that bill.
Exactly.
And so having a multi-bin system with prioritization would address some of the foot dragging.
Yeah.
For the volume of petitions they have now that was never contemplated in 1982.
Right. Okay. Right. The other piece of this bill that I'd mention quickly is, so the act is originally so this bill envisions enhancing the role of states, getting states more involved in the recovery of species and planning for recovery and recovering species. The original act, when you go back to 1973 and look at the legislative history, if you're a policy wonk and an ESA wonk like I am, you do that. You go back and you read the legislative history, and you find out that Congress at the time said this act is only going to work if states are really engaged and involved in species recovery. That's the only way it's going to work, because the federal government doesn't have the personnel or the resources to do it, and the states have the boots on the ground, the biologists and the budgets and so forth. They have a greater ability and they know the land, they know the people, they have a greater ability to facilitate recovery. So the only way this act is going to work is if the states are involved, and they created a mechanism to try and send money to the states to get them involved. Only that money was never really there. And the states have never really engaged. There's some engagement. I'm not going to say the states aren't engaged, but they're not engaged the way the act originally contemplated. And so the bill is trying to change that.
Right.
And get back to that original intent.
I had read an article suggesting that that has always been contemplated in the statute, yet the administrations over time have written regulations that interpret a statute in a way that sort of makes that not a viable option. And,
correct.
And so is this intended to kind of bring back focus to that concept of state-led efforts?
Exactly. And I've read articles, maybe the same article that you've read, but I've read articles that have suggested you don't actually need to change the statute. The intent's always been there. The language in the statute is there. You just need to change the regulation, and then you're fine.
Yeah, didn't Temple Soldier write a law review? Was it a law review article?
Yeah, she did. Now we're calling her out.
Yeah, that's fine.
No, Temple. Yeah, we know Temple well. She is a law professor at the University of Wyoming, and she had an article published in Berkeley, one of the Berkeley law reviews, on it. And that was her argument. And I've told her this to her face, so if she's listening, it's nothing I wouldn't tell her personally, Temple. You know that I disagree with you. That I agree with you that the flexibility is in the bill, in the existing act, to make those amendments and enhance the role of states, or not make amendments, but to change the regulations to enhance the role of states. But my point has been, look at what happens when we have such diverse political opinions in this country. Look what happens when we have elections. The first thing that the new administration does is they try and undo everything the prior administration did. And the easiest way to do that is by undoing regulations. Mm-hmm. Right. And so if states want certainty, and if we want certainty in administration of the act, yeah, we can write some regulations that enhance the role of states, but who's to say that another administration won't come in and undo that? And so to get the certainty and predictability, and which is what this bill tries to do, is it puts it in statute.
Sure. And when you think about it, Congress has delegated a lot of authority and directed the agency to do something, and sometimes they have to remind them.
And I think that's what this bill is. It's a kick in the pants a little bit, like a reminder to say, hey, what we said in 1973 we meant. We really want the states to have a more active role. Should be clear. I've heard some criticisms of the bill saying we can't trust states because the species wouldn't have been on the list in the first place if it wasn't for states messing up. Right?
Yeah, which is laughable.
Right. There are a lot of counter arguments to that, and I don't know that we want to dive into those here, the counter arguments, but
it just suffices to say there are a lot of things outside of state control that can lead to those. But for there are many things that are.
But for those that have that fear, this bill is written in such a way that there are backstops on that. So for every place where a state's given an opportunity to have more authority, that authority can be taken away by the secretary. Mm-hmm. So there are backstops and there are checks on that. So in case that fear is out there. Those are and what does it mean by enhancing the role of states? Basically, it means giving states an opportunity to lead recovery teams, which are the scientific bodies that are put together to formulate plans to bring species back and get them off the list. Right? Giving states an opportunity to develop recovery plans. What are the measurable objectives we need to hit to try and get these species off the list? Those are the big things we're talking about. Things that right now the federal government doesn't have the personnel or the resources to do, which is why 30%, over 500 species, have no recovery plan, because there aren't the resources to put in place recovery plans for all these species right now.
Yeah, not going off on too much of a tangent or trying to be political in terms of party. There's a great libertarian writer, writes for a libertarian think tank named Randy Simmons, and one of the things that he talked about, heavily is this idea that when you create law and you try and, the Endangered Species Act is a perfect example. You create a law and let's consider it a box. And when you tell everybody exactly what everything has to look like in that box, and you do it from, the highest level of government possible, and you hand it to somebody at the local level, they're usually resentful. Sometimes the tools in the box don't work. It's usually, it's envisioned differently. And the argument here is the principle of the box. It's dynamist principles that what you do to make a good law is you make a law that allows people at the local level or at the state level to innovate. And that you have to have some prescriptions in there so that tells people the direction to go. But within that box, you have to allow them to put the tools in that box that meet their needs on the ground, because allowing that local innovation, that local capacity to find out what works and sometimes to make mistakes and have to come back and redo it. That's how you actually get stuff done. Not only that, that's how you get the buy-in. You get the people on the ground to feel like it's their plan, to feel like they were part of the solution. Because when people come up with their own solution and their own plan, they carry it forward to save that species or that whatever else, they own it. Versus being able to point back at, for example, DC and say, you sent this to us, it doesn't work, we're not even going to do it.
No, you're exactly right. That's a great point, and you're exactly right. And that's one of the things I think this bill attempts to accomplish. Now, are there things in this bill that are more challenging and controversial? Certainly. And that's a dialogue that's going to continue over the weeks and months to come to try and get this thing to a point that more folks can get behind and agree this is something that can work. We'll see what happens. It may not go anywhere. We haven't seen a bill on ESA go anywhere in 30 years. This may just fall into that same category. But this was an interesting approach compared to some of the other approaches out there.
It's the best opportunity for meaningful change that is positive. And none of us want to see, everybody agrees, right? Everybody agrees they care about these animals, the species that these things are.
We talked about that earlier.
Everybody agrees. And everybody should agree this is the best opportunity we had in 30 years to change this thing in a meaningful way that makes the act work better.
Yeah, and work better for wildlife, right?
Absolutely.
That's the one thing. We're talking about making it work better for wildlife, which ultimately, if it works better for wildlife, it'll work better for people too, right? So the other piece that we want to talk about is the administrative piece. So we talked about these two, the legislative approaches, but there's a pretty significant regulatory package that's been proposed by the administration, right?
Department of the Interior.
Department of Interior,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And it's interesting when you break this down. So there's two different regulations, proposed regulations. It's a big overhaul. There's a lot to it. In fact, if you really look at it closely, if you read this package closely, and this was proposed back on July 25th, is when it was published in the Federal Register. The notice went out. There are about 36 unique proposals, individual proposals in this. And I'm not going to get into a lot of them, but one thing I want to say, and I don't know where you guys are in this, you might have a totally different opinion than I do, but it's been my experience watching, and it doesn't matter who's in power, right? But I'm going to use the current administration, the Trump administration, as an example. For any regulation that's put out, that he puts out, that comes out of this administration, that comes out of Secretary Zinke's office, there is a presumption by those that did not vote for, the current administration, mm-hmm. right? That the attempt is to undercut the act and to gut the act or whatever that regulatory proposal might be, right? There's without even looking at the language, there's a negative connotation, a negative presumption, and a negative spin put on the package before actually even diving in and looking at it.
It's unfortunate. It is the political reality right now. And people, everybody should quit. I will, I don't care whether you like, who you like, whether you voted the guy that's in there or not, or like the secretary he picked. It doesn't do anybody a service, all these efforts that we see something come down, and before you even really understand what the guy might be trying to do, everybody's just throwing each other under the bus. It is not the way to govern. It's really bad policy, it's not a good thing.
So I want to point listeners to a particular document, because we're not going to have time to dive into this. But if you're interested in learning more about the regulatory package, a colleague of mine, Jake Lee, recently joined the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. And Jake is he is I hold him in high esteem and view him as an ESA expert. He's developed a paper through this Environmental Policy Innovation Center that analyzes this regulatory proposal. And I think and he does it from they're obviously taking it from the perspective as we want to advance conservation. We want to do things that are good for conservation. We want to see things that are good for species on the ground. And he's trying to take a pragmatic approach to looking at these regulations. And what I think is worth noting is he identifies several places where he has some concerns about the regulatory language, where he thinks it might not benefit conservation. For example, there's a proposal in there in the regulation that says, in a listing determination, the Fish and Wildlife Service has to do an economic analysis. Now, that economic analysis cannot be considered as part of the listing determination. That's been settled by the court. We talked about that in part 1. But it would require that it be in there. And there's some fear about how that economic analysis could be used down the road. And I think it's an understandable and maybe a warranted fear about how that economic analysis can be used down the road to push for different amendments to the ESA. He raises some valid points. I can understand that perspective, I guess is my point. I can understand that perspective. But he also points out that there are some provisions in this that could be really good for conservation. Like, did you know that the Fish and Wildlife Service, for consultations every year, is doing? Oh boy! Now I should have had this up before I started down this path. But it's where did it go? Several 100,000 consultations in a year.
Was it like 10,000?
Or 10,000.
No, I don't know. Well, I didn't read it, but
what's an order of magnitude between friends?
Yeah, right. I was trying to pull it up because it's a pretty staggering number. The number of consultations that they're required to do that the Fish and Wildlife Service has to do.
While you're looking, I'll just explain that anytime a project's going to happen that requires some sort of federal approval, like the BLM is going to look at something.
You make a road somewhere.
Yeah, so they will then go to the Fish and Wildlife Service and consult with them and say, what will this project do to threatened or endangered species or candidate species and things like that. So the Fish and Wildlife Service then does an analysis of the project and puts a written determination down and gives it back to the other federal agency.
So that consultation is getting the biologists and the people in the know involved and getting their opinions on what you're about to, on the road you're about to put in or whatever else you're about to do.
So it's not that it's a phone call. It's a very detailed analysis that takes a lot of time and resources.
Yeah. It can be as simple as a phone call. It honestly can be. A consultation can be as simple as a phone call. But it can go into a very detailed analysis that requires putting together a biological opinion.
Right, and that'll be scaled up or down according to
We're getting Dave some readers before the next podcast so he can find these.
Yeah, because I'm sitting here trying to find it, and I'm struggling to find the actual specific number. But suffice it to say, it's a large number. The number of consultations done a year is large, and what the proposal would do is streamline that and reduce some of the paperwork and allow the consultation to occur quicker. It also would reward, it would allow for an expedited consultation in the event that you have some voluntary conservation going on the ground to benefit the specific species that is involved in the consultation. If you do that, you can get through the consultation even faster. That's pretty innovative. If you're trying to, like you were talking about before, Nephi, you want to find innovative ways to, empower folks to innovate on the ground and to create these new opportunities for conservation. That's one of the things this package does.
So I found it. So it
took him like 2 seconds.
10 seconds. Considering that the Fish and Wildlife Service completed an average of 11,344 consultations annually from 2011 to 2017.
There you go.
Even small changes can yield outsized effects. So who was closer?
Your 10,000 was closer than my several 100,000. But anyway, so 11,000 consultations a year. That's a lot of consultations a year. And anything that you can do to streamline that process and speed it up can have a scaled impact, right? Mm-hmm. So I would just encourage folks. I mean, my point in saying this is there are some things in here that might, that I can understand people would be concerned about. There are some things in here that if you are looking to advance conservation, there's some good stuff in these regulations too. And so I encourage you to take a look at that. And if you don't have the time to digest it all, which by the way, it's available on the federalregister.gov site, and you can go find them there and submit your comments there. The comment period is open until September 24th. That's when it closes. But if you need some guidance, and I would suggest looking at this Environmental Policy Innovation Center's Endangered Species Act 2018 Administrative Reform, Initial Perspectives on Proposed Regulatory Changes.
Just Google that.
Just Google that, and you'll find it. There's good information there. We might put it on our website or on our Facebook page. So check out those places, and if you want to get a link to that.
Yeah,
but that can be.
It's not long.
It's not long, but. I think it's safe to say that from an administrative standpoint, this administration is committed to making some changes to ESA and the way it works. And so I encourage you to take a look at these regulations, because something is going to come out of there and is going to be approved, and that's going to be the way the act is implemented. So take a look at that. Have anything else to add on that?
No.
Nephi?
Nope.
So here we are. I think this is a good place to wrap up our 3 parts. Know that there are these things out there. Know that not everything you read in the paper, not everything you see on the news criticizing changes to the act are necessarily true. Do your own homework. Understand that there are ways to make this act work better. Nothing is perfect. This is a human creation. This act is. Nothing is perfect. It can be improved upon. Don't automatically assume the worst. Do your own homework. And we're not going to be done with this. We'll keep you updated on what's going on. And we'll keep touching back on ESA as we move forward. I'm sure it'll be weaved into future discussions. We'll have to talk about some species specific stuff, things related to the Endangered Species Act. And now you'll hopefully have at least a framework of information, baseline of information to be able to kind of follow along in the dialogue. Hopefully this has been helpful to you to give you some baseline information about how the act works, give you some resources, understand what's going on at the federal level.
Listen to the 3 podcasts, and even if you don't have a PhD on endangered species issues, pretend like you do now.
Yeah, you'll have... that next time you're around the water cooler and everybody's talking about Section 4 and Section 7.
Guy around that cooler now.
I don't know how many.
Thank me later. Oh, I guess I can.
I know you've all been around that water cooler where you're talking Section 4, right? Now you'll be ready. So that's it. That's your ESA 101. That's your parts 1, 2, and 3. That's the history of the act, how the act works, and the proposed changes to the act.
Send an email to Dave. He'll send you your challenge coin.
There's no challenge
There's
coin.
no challenge coin.
You should get
maybe a Your Mountain challenge coin.
Yeah, right.
Anyway.
Anybody who listen to those 3 podcasts deserves it.
That's probably true. We wonked out a little bit, I guess.
I think Nephi just wants one.
He wants a challenge coin. I'm looking at all your challenge coins. I think maybe you want one too.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Mike's got a couple.
Yeah, he does. Anyway, that's the ESA in a nutshell. And we'll talk about it more later. And we look forward to the next Your Mountain podcast. Thanks for listening. Look forward to talking again soon.
Mike here from the Your Mountain podcast. We need a favor. Go on our website, itsyourmountain.com, and find the links to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so that you can like and follow us, and also so that you can share us with your friends. Wherever you got this podcast from, go ahead and click subscribe, rate us, and leave a comment. These simple things will really help us get the word out. That's itsyourmountain.com. Thanks for the help.